Hello, listeners. It's Gunter Swoboda here with some exciting news. We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organization cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self development, and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spigener-Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Welcome everyone to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. Now before I get going, I want to point something out, and that is that my views in this podcast are solely my own, and if I take something from somewhere else, I'll usually reference it or I'll make a comment about that. This podcast essentially is intended for informational and educational purposes only. It's not to suggest anything that you can do therapeutically. If that's the case, you need to consult a therapist. However, if some of the things that I suggest make sense to you, then by all means, pursue that further. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is that I had some fantastic news this week, and we now have a community that has downloaded over 100,000 episodes a week. I am so stoked. This is fantastic, and it's growing in places that I never thought would be even interested in this. So yeah, fantastic news, very encouraging. So in my previous discussions, particularly in the last podcast, which focused on the breadwinner model and the adverse effects it has on men's health, I have explored a whole bunch of themes related to this. But today what I want to do is I want to take a bit of biology, a bit of psychology, and a bit of, in a sense, sociology and integrate them. And so how am I going to do that? Well, basically, I want to present very briefly what we know about the human biological, psychological, and social stress response. So that means I'm going to look at a bit of biology, a bit about psychology, and how society plays a role in this. Now, if you've been paying attention, you may have guessed where this is going. Yes, I'm talking about cortisol, stress, longevity, and the crucial role gender can play in our experiences above. Now, I'm going to throw this out there. One of the big questions that comes up in biology and medicine is why do women tend to live longer than men? So how do stress and cortisol regulation differ between the two? And it must do. In some form or another, there has to be a difference. Now, the obvious adjunct for me as someone who's looking to help men achieve a better well-being is how can we redefine masculinity to foster a healthier, longer-lived life and a society that supports this. So let's explore this through the lens of science, psychology, and a bit about sociology or social structures to see what we can learn and change, because we can change this. So let me start off by talking about the role of hormones and what's called the HPA axis. Now, and that's particularly relevant to women, and I'll get to this in a minute. So, if we're going to talk about stress, anxiety, and arousal in the human being, it is fundamentally important to think about the role of cortisol, which is recognized as the body's primary stress hormone. Cortisol plays a crucial role in regulating our fight or flight or freeze response. It's a physiological reaction that prepares us to either confront, run away, or freeze from perceived threats. This hormone is produced by the adrenal glands and it's released in response to stress. However, it's important to note that men and women often have differing ways of regulating cortisol levels in response to stress. Now, these differences can be influenced by a variety of factors, including hormonal variations, psychological responses, and social dynamics. Now, this highlights the complexity of how stress impacts individuals based on gender. Understanding these nuances is vital for developing effective stress management strategies and tailoring each of those to the person's needs. So let me kick it off. Testosterone versus estrogen. So testosterone, which is the dominant male hormone, tends to amplify cortisol reactivity, meaning men are biologically wired to have more intense but short-lived stress responses. Now, having said that, there's a difference between an acute stress response where cortisol elevates but then returns back to normal in a reasonable time, and a chronically elevated cortisol reaction. Now, estrogen, on the other hand, has a buffering effect, reducing chronic stress related damage, at least until menopause when estrogen levels drop. So I use this funky word about the HPA axis differences. So what we're talking about in terms of HPA, well, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which in women stays activated longer than men, meaning, again, that their cortisol response lingers after stressful events. This increases vulnerability to anxiety and depression. Now, in normal conditions, men's cortisol levels spike quickly but return to baseline faster. However, as I said, chronic stress leads to blunted cortisol responses over time, increasing the risk for metabolic and immune disorders. However, my clinical observation as well has been that it is relatively straightforward to be able to pick when men have been experiencing elevations in cortisol for a long time. They have issues with inflammatory responses in their system, their sleep's affected, cognition is affected. Okay, so we've got to be a bit careful here when we make blanket statements. So one of the things that helps reduce cortisol levels relatively quickly and effectively is actually human touch, which increases oxytocin. So if you're feeling a little stressy, one way of getting that down and getting comfortable back to being comfortable in yourself is get a hug or hold hands with your partner or in some cases get a massage. So while biology plays a role, we have to look at how social situations, context, and expectation shape our ability to cope with stress. So, in this particular section of the podcast, uh, what I'm trying to do is to create a connection between psychological and behavioral difference in stress coping. One of the biggest contributors to early mortality in men isn't just biology, it's how we're socialized to deal with stress. Women, on average, rely on emotional expression and social support, while most of us men tend to turn to avoidance, sometimes risk taking, or unhealthy coping mechanisms. Now, again, I'm using overgeneralizations, but it helps to get a bit of a picture around this. So let's talk about socialization and coping mechanisms. The literature tends to identify that women tend to seek support and emotional regulation, which mitigates stress and promotes longevity. As men, we're conditioned to suppress emotions, and in doing so, look for ways in which we can maintain the lid on what we're feeling, which means either turning to alcohol, drugs, some of us, increase our risk taking behavior, or a common one, which is essentially to throw ourselves into work and activities. Even chronically going to the gym is one of those issues. So, the argument in the literature is that women have a higher rate of internalizing disorders, anxiety and depression, but are more likely to seek treatment. From the literature, the picture seems to suggest that men experience externalizing disorders, aggression, substance abuse, which often go undiagnosed and untreated, increasing the risk of heart disease, addiction, and suicide. My clinical experience, and I'm going to rely on 40 years essentially plus working with boys, teenage boys, and men, is that certainly anxiety is often not recognized in men very well. Um, and a lot of stuff is diagnosed as depression when actually the primary issue is anxiety, from which the person eventually begins to feel depressed or has depressive symptoms. So, what's the link here then to society and the part of society that I want to talk about, which is where does workplace culture and economic pressure come into play here? As I said in a previous episode, I explored the breadwinner model and how it pressures men into unsustainable roles. So let's revisit parts of that. So we're talking about the economic and social dimensions of stress and its impact on longevity. Masculinity, as traditionally defined, has always been tied to work and financial accumulation or stability For generations, men have been conditioned to see their worth in terms of productivity, success, and providing for their families. But it comes at a serious cost. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that women don't work. In fact, when we look at what women actually do culturally and historically, is they work a lot. But in the male sphere, that work is not seen as financially valued. What's valued is when we go out into the world and we have a job. So the whole domestic aspect is completely devalued. And so women have often been sort of, seen as someone who doesn't work. Now, I don't know about you, but having spent 12 months at home with a young baby and trying to do housework and stuff, I can tell you it's a heavy gig. And hand on heart, there were aspects of it that I was not very good at. I was absolutely brilliant at taking care of the baby, but actually running the household, I wasn't very good at. So there were things that, I would neglect, like the laundry. I won't go into details at that point, but you'll get the picture. So coming back to the breadwinner model and chronic stress, right? We have a situation where men are into high stress work roles, leaving them with little room for emotional expression or work life balance. Okay, one of the big problems in most workplaces is that people are expected to take a great deal of responsibility but have little autonomy or agency in what they do within the context of what they're doing, which is bad news. So, this leads to chronic cortisol elevation, increasing rates of heart disease, high blood pressure, and premature death. But along the way, it also impacts poorly, negatively, on our emotional, psychological well being. So, there's even, cognitive deficits that arise from that. Things like impact on short term memory, problem solving, decision making, concentration, focus, right? And it's interesting that at a time where these pressures are particularly pronounced, we have a significant increase in conditions that are related to overarousal, like ADHD. And one of the characteristics that I see in ADHD is the struggle to regulate both emotions and cognitions. Now, one of the things that's come out essentially in Australia over the last couple of years is that there was a policy release, which is that organisations are now responsible for a psychosocial well-being policy. Now, the question is this going to be a game changer? Well, I'd like to think it would be, but I'm not convinced. I get exposed to lots of people from different industries and different professions, and in a 12-month period, I've not seen a great change in that. However, having said that, if it was implemented well, this could shift workplace culture away from burnout and towards sustainability, which is a critical step in improving men's longevity. So now I thought I'd give you a little quick history tour um, to put this all in context. So I'll go into different phases of history. So let's talk about the pre-industrial societies before the 1800s. Stress was episodic and survival based. It was usually to do with war, famine, disease. Longevity was fundamentally limited by infectious diseases and to some degree accidents, especially if you were if you were working class, then it was hard work, hard physical labor. So it wasn't chronic stress related illnesses that took people out as much as it was other factors. We can then come into the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s to the early 1900s, and work is now becoming more chronic and more demanding, leading to long term stress related diseases. The breadwinner model is now being consolidated. And so the stress levels that men are experiencing jump significantly. We then move into the post World War II economic boom, 1950s to the 1970s. Economic stability reduced acute stress, but rigid gender roles kept chronic stress high. And in this period, high stress corporate jobs led to higher rates of male heart disease and hypertension. Okay, so we had during that period a lot of job security, remuneration for what you did was relatively solid, but we're starting to see um, environments like corporations where jobs are under the pump. It's highly hierarchical. It's highly political. And in a lot of cases, it's not the work that's stressing people out; it's the politics in the workplace. So, what about the 21st century? Now, my view is that we've created a burnout culture and a massive level of work stress. We have a significant shift in job, security. I'll refer to it for what it is. It's job insecurity. There's a massive increase of automation, so financial security is challenged, and the biggest issue is economic inequality, and this has made stress, chronic stress, worse than ever. Men in high pressure industries have some of the highest mortality rates. Now, women are experiencing rising rates of autoimmune diseases and anxiety due to trying to balance professional and caregiving roles, because the division of labour still puts the domestic stuff into the basket for women to carry. So, we got to ask ourselves, are we going to let this continue? Or are we actually going to do something about it? And so there are little bits that are already in place, like the psychosocial wellbeing policy, but is it being enacted on properly? And my argument is there is still a total resistance to changing not just workplace culture, but society as a whole to make it work better for the individual families and communities. So this podcast, and I do bring in women, but on a secondary level, is focused on the idea that if we want men to live longer, healthier lives, we need to rethink how traditional masculinity is actually throwing a spanner in the works. If we want to improve longevity for men, we need to focus on moving away from the sort of stoic, work driven identity and embrace emotional expression and emotional support networks. We need to challenge economic structures. We need to advocate for work-life balance policies like the psychosocial well-being initiative, but actually see it put to practice. It needs to get traction at a grassroots level. We also need to look at developing gender-specific health interventions, targeting early intervention for stress-related illnesses in men. And unfortunately, the balance here that's emerged is rather than having people engage with talk therapies, we're giving them essentially more stuff to suppress their feelings with. And again, it's a spectrum. Okay, so we go from feelings to symptoms to disorder to distress to disorders. So you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about medicating our experience so that we can continue to do what we've been doing that is in fact often killing us. Now let me stress that what I'm looking at is that we need to break free from outdated ideals of what to be as a man. Strong, stoic, uh, top dog, socially successful, and highly competitive. All these things create elevations in cortisol levels that, if not dealt with, lead to poor health, overall health, physical, mental, and social health. Why is it that people are often very, very angry in crowds? There's a good reason for that, but I won't go into that in this episode. So this is a podcast I want everyone to seriously think about. Most of the time, a large amount of what I see in my practice has to do with chronic stress and chronic cortisol elevation. And if we begin to regulate that, the person actually has the opportunity to think clearer, to feel more grounded. So on that note, this has been another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I hope this has been useful. I'd like to think that all of my podcasts are useful. Please, if you're subscribed or downloading, please leave a response. Be happy to have a read. Obviously, I can't return everybody's messages, but there may be some way in which we can set that up. Now, if this episode has really resonated with you, share it, discuss it, throw it into your community, and most importantly, look at how you can take action. Until next time, stay inspired, challenge the norm, and this is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.